Settlers laughed at the cave shelter she built for $8. Silas Torsten, who had survived 6 Kansas winters, told her plainly, "You'll be dead before spring. Those children will die with you." She had $8, 2 children, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours. But 5 months earlier, Maren Lindquist had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. The cave wasn't much. A shallow bite in the chalk bluff, 15 feet deep and 8 feet high at the mouth, narrowing to a crack at the back. Water stains ran down the pale stone where rain had found its way in over centuries. The floor was uneven, littered with fallen rock and the bones of animals that had crawled inside to die. Maren stood at the entrance in August of 1887, her 2 children behind her, and knew this was all she could afford, $8.43. That was everything. The train from Pennsylvania had cost $62 for the 3 of them. The wagon ride from the railroad stop at Grainfield had cost another $4. She'd spent her last real money on flour, salt, coffee, and a second-hand rifle with 17 cartridges. What remained wouldn't buy a single wall of a proper house. Gove County had been organized only the year before. The land office clerk in Grainfield had looked at her like she was mad when she asked about unclaimed parcels with natural shelter. Most settlers wanted flat ground for farming. Maren wanted something else entirely. The children, Anna, 7, and Peter, 4, peered around her skirts at the opening in the chalk. "Are we going to live in there?" Anna asked. "We're going to make it livable," Maren said. She said it with more confidence than she felt. The nearest neighbor was Silas Torsten, a Norwegian bachelor who'd survived 6 Kansas winters in a soddy 3 miles east. Word traveled fast in empty country. By the time Maren had unloaded her meager possessions from the borrowed wagon, Torsten was riding up on a bay mare that looked better fed than he did. He dismounted slowly, studying the cave mouth, then studying Maren, then studying the cave mouth again. His face had the wind-burned creases of a man who'd spent too many years squinting at horizons. "You're the widow from back east," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "This your claim?" "It will be. I'm filing tomorrow." Torsten walked to the cave entrance and looked inside. He stood there a long moment, hands on his hips, then turned back to her with an expression she would come to know well. The expression that said she was already dead. She just didn't know it yet. "Ma'am," he said, "I've buried 3 neighbors since I came to Kansas. 2 froze in blizzards. 1 starved when his crops failed. I've seen men with twice your resources give up by Christmas." He paused, making sure she was listening. "A woman alone, with children, living in a hole in the rock. You'll be dead before spring, and those children will die with you." Anna pressed closer to Maren's leg. Peter was too young to understand the words, but he understood the tone. "I've survived worse," Maren said. "Have you?" Torsten's voice held no cruelty, only a flat certainty. "Have you cut 8 cords of firewood by yourself? Have you hunted your own meat through 3 feet of snow? Have you kept a fire burning for 4 months straight while nursing sick children?" 8 cords. The number landed like a stone in her stomach. "That's what you'll need," Torsten continued. 8 cords minimum, and that's if you have a proper cabin with a good stove. For that, he gestured at the cave. "I don't even know what you'll need. Nobody lives in caves, Mrs. Lindquist. There's a reason for that." "The Cheyenne lived in caves," Maren said. "There were women in this very formation not 10 years ago. They survived." Torsten's expression shifted, something between pity and disgust. "The Cheyenne were starving and running from the army. They weren't trying to homestead, and most of them died anyway." He mounted his horse. I'll check on you in October. If you're still alive, I'll help you build a proper dugout before the worst cold. But I'm telling you now, the way you're planning it, you won't make October." He rode away without looking back. Marin watched him go, then turned to face the cave. 15 feet deep, 8 feet high, a floor of broken chalk and ancient bones. She had $8, 2 children, and needed 8 cords of firewood she had no idea how to cut. Winter was 5 months away. The first problem wasn't the cave, it was the distance. The nearest trees, a thin line of cottonwoods along a creek 3 miles south, might as well have been on the moon. Marin had no horse, no mule, no wagon of her own. The borrowed wagon had gone back to Grainfield with the man who'd brought her. Every stick of firewood would have to be carried by hand. She did the mathematics at night, lying on a blanket on the cave's uneven floor while the children slept. 1 cord of wood equaled 128 cubic feet, a pile 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. She'd watched her father stack wood back in Pennsylvania. She knew a cord weighed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds, depending on the wood. 8 cords meant 30,000 pounds of wood. 30,000 pounds carried 3 miles by a woman who weighed 118 pounds soaking wet. At 50 pounds per trip, the most she could realistically carry, that was 600 trips. 600 trips of 6 miles round journey. 3,600 miles of walking just for the firewood, and she had to cut it first, and split it, and stack it, and she had to do all of this while keeping 2 children fed, filing her homestead claim, and making the cave habitable before the first freeze. The numbers didn't work. No matter how she arranged them, the numbers did not work. She thought about Torsten's words. "You'll be dead before spring." She thought about going back. The train to Pennsylvania would cost $62. She had 8. She thought about the children, asleep in a cave, trusting her to keep them alive. And then she thought about something else. The cave wasn't cold. In August, with the prairie baking under a sun that felt like an open furnace door, the cave held a steady coolness. Marin had noticed it the first day and thought nothing of it. Shade was shade. But lying awake in the darkness, she realized it was more than that. The air inside the cave wasn't just cooler than outside. It was exactly the same temperature it had been that morning, and the morning before. She remembered something her father had said about root cellars. The earth keeps its own temperature, 50-some degrees year-round once you get deep enough. The heat of summer can't reach it. The cold of winter can't either. Marin sat up in the darkness. If the cave was 50 degrees in August, it would be 50 degrees in January. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but not cold enough to kill. The wood she needed wasn't for heating a space from 0 to 65 degrees. It was for heating a space from 50 to 65, 15 degrees instead of 65. The mathematics changed. But the cave mouth was open to the wind. Every bit of warmed air would blow straight out into the Kansas night. She needed to close the opening somehow, not just plug it, but create a space that could be heated separately from the cave itself. A shelter within a shelter. The idea came together slowly, piece by piece, over 3 sleepless nights. She couldn't afford lumber. She couldn't afford nails in the quantities a proper wall would need. She couldn't afford glass or hinges or any of the things a real building required. But she'd seen wiki-ups in a book back east, the dome shelters the Apache built from bent saplings and hides. And she'd seen the trash pile behind the general store in Grainfield, heaped with empty tin cans that nobody wanted, saplings she could cut herself. There were willows along that same creek where the cottonwoods grew. Willows bent, tin cans she could have for free. The storekeeper would be glad to have someone haul away as garbage. She wouldn't build a cabin at all. She'd build a dome, A curved wall of bent saplings covered in flattened tin cans fitted across the cave mouth like a cork in a bottle. A space maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, small enough to heat with a fraction of the wood a cabin would need. The cave itself would be her insulation. The rock would be her walls. The chalk, which had spent 1,000,000 years at the same temperature, would be her thermal mass. The next morning, she walked to Grainfield, 9 miles each way, to file her homestead claim and ask about tin cans. The storekeeper was a man named Harlan Goss, with a belly that strained his suspenders and fingers perpetually stained with tobacco juice. He listened to her request with growing disbelief. "You want my trash?" he said. "Yes." "Tin cans, empty ones." "As many as you have." Goss stared at her for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. It was not a kind laugh. "Ox lady, I've seen some desperate settlers in my time, but you might be the sorriest case yet. You know what people are saying about you? That crazy widow who's going to live in a cave? Now you want to build something out of garbage?" Marin kept her voice level. "Will you give me the cans or not?" "Oh, I'll give them to you. I'll give you every blessed can behind this store, and I'll throw in some from the hotel too. But I'm telling you right now." He leaned forward, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and old sweat. "You're wasting your time. Whatever fool thing you're building, it won't save you when the real cold comes. I've seen blizzards in Kansas that would freeze a person solid in 20 minutes. Your garbage hut isn't going to stop that. The only thing that stops that is a proper house with proper heating and proper supplies. Things you can't afford." He grinned, showing brown teeth. "Tell you what, though, when you give up, and you will give up, you come see me. I might be able to find some work for a woman willing to do certain jobs. Nothing fancy, but it'd keep you and those kids fed until you can afford a ticket back to wherever you came from." Marin looked at him steadily. "I'll take the cans," she said. By September 1st, she had carried 400 tin cans from Grainfield to the cave, making the trip twice a week with a canvas sack on her back and a child on each hand. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her feet blistered, healed, and blistered again. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But the cans accumulated. She flattened them with a rock, hammering each one until it lay more or less flat, then stacking them inside the cave where the children couldn't cut themselves on the edges. The pile grew. The saplings came harder. Willows along the creek were thin and numerous, but they had to be cut, stripped of branches, and carried 3 miles uphill. Each sapling weighed only a few pounds, but she needed dozens of them. Her hands cracked and bled from the work. The hatchet she'd bought, 78 cents. The cheapest one in Grainfield was dull within a week and needed constant sharpening against a chunk of sandstone. Elsa Magnuson noticed the traffic. Elsa and her husband Henrik had a soddy 2 miles northeast of Marin's cave. They were the nearest neighbors besides Torsten, and Elsa was the only other woman within a day's walk. She came by on a hot September afternoon, ostensibly to bring some early vegetables from her garden, really to see what the crazy cave woman was doing. Marin was hammering cans flat when Elsa arrived. The pile of finished tin was waist high. The pile of saplings, stripped and drying, reached nearly to the cave mouth. Elsa stood looking at the materials for a long moment. "What are you building?" she finally asked. Marin explained. The dome, the cave's constant temperature, the reduced fuel requirements. As she talked, she saw Elsa's face shift from curiosity to confusion to something harder. "So you're betting your children's lives," Elsa said slowly, "on a theory about cave temperatures." "It's not a theory. The cave is 55 degrees right now. It will be 55 degrees in January." "And if it isn't?" The question hung there. "If it isn't," Marin said, "I'll have a shelter I can heat with whatever wood I've managed to collect. which is more than I'd have with no shelter at all. Elsa shook her head. We have neighbors who've died in Kansas blizzards, Mrs. Lindquist. The Hendricks family, 4 years ago, father, mother, 2 children, all of them found frozen in their cabin because they ran out of wood. The cabin was properly built. They just didn't have enough fuel. She gestured at the saplings and tin cans. You're not building a proper cabin. You're building a toy, a play structure. And you're going to put your children in it and hope the winter isn't bad. I'm building something that fits what I have, Marin said. $8 doesn't buy proper. $8 buys this or nothing. $8 buys a ticket to somewhere warmer. Not for 3 people. Elsa looked at her with genuine pity. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you came here. She left the vegetables, turnips, and a few small onions, and walked away without saying goodbye. The vegetables were the first food anyone had given Marin since she'd arrived. She fed them to the children that night and tried not to think about what Elsa had said. You're betting your children's lives on a theory? She was. There was no denying it. By September 15th, she had driven the first saplings into the cave floor. The chalk was softer than she'd expected, soft enough that she could carve holes with a knife and a hammer, then wedge the sapling bases in tight. She worked in an arc across the cave mouth, setting the poles 18 inches apart, angling them inward. When she had 11 poles set on one side and 11 on the opposite side, she bent them toward the center. The wood creaked and fought her. Willows were flexible, but they weren't infinitely so. 2 saplings cracked before she figured out the right technique, soaking them overnight, bending them gradually, tying them in place and letting them set before bending further. It added days to the work. Days she didn't have. Anna helped where she could, handing tools, fetching water, watching Peter while Marin wrestled with the framework. The girl was 7 years old and already understood that their survival depended on what her mother was building. She didn't complain when dinner was thin. She didn't cry when she cut her hand on a tin edge. She just wrapped the cut in a strip of cloth and kept working. Peter was too young to help much, but he stayed close to the cave, playing in the chalk dust, stacking rocks, occasionally bringing Marin things he thought she might need: a feather, a smooth stone, a dried flower. He didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that Mama was building something, and building was interesting to watch. The framework took shape. By October 1st, the skeleton was complete. 22 saplings bent into a dome that spanned the cave mouth, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall at the center, lashed together with rope and strips of bark. It looked like the rib cage of some great beast, white willow bones against the pale chalk walls. Now came the covering. Marin started at the bottom, overlapping the flattened cans like shingles on a roof, wiring each one to the framework with thin metal she'd salvaged from the same trash piles that had given her the cans. The work was tedious and painful. The tin edges were sharp, the wire cut into her fingers, and the Kansas sun beat down relentlessly even in early October. But the wall grew. Silas Torsten came by on October 3rd, as he'd promised. He sat on his horse, looking at the half-finished structure, and didn't say anything for a long time. "You're still alive," he finally observed. "I am. That thing," he gestured at the dome. "What is it?" "A wall, a shell across the cave mouth. When it's finished, I'll have a sealed space I can heat." Torsten dismounted and walked closer, examining the construction. He tested the framework with his hands, tugged at the tin shingles, looked at the way the structure fitted against the cave walls. "Huh," he said. It was the most positive sound Marin had heard in months. "The idea is sound," Torsten said slowly. "In theory. The cave holds temperature, I'll grant you that, and a small space is easier to heat than a large one. But He turned to face her. How much wood do you have? Maren felt her stomach clench. A quarter cord. Maybe a third. A quarter cord. Torsten repeated the words like a verdict. Mrs. Lindquist, it's October. First snow could come any week. A quarter cord might last you 2 months if you're lucky and it's a mild winter. It won't get you to spring. I'll get more. How? You spent 2 months building this thing. The creek's not getting any closer, and once the snow comes, you won't be able to make those trips anymore. The drifts on this prairie pile higher than a man's head. Maren had no answer for him. She'd known in the back of her mind that the wood was a problem. She'd hoped the shelter's efficiency would make up for the shortage. But hope wasn't mathematics. I'm telling you this because I don't want to watch you die, Torsten said. You're stubborn and maybe a little crazy, but you've worked harder than most men I know. That counts for something. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canvas sack. This is venison, dried. Should keep you through October if you ration it. And he hesitated. I've got some scrap wood. Cottonwood mostly, not the best burning, but it's wood. I'll bring you a quarter cord if you'll trade me labor in the spring. It was the kindest thing anyone had offered her since she had arrived. I'll take it, she said, and I'll work your spring planting if I'm able. If you're able. Torsten shook his head. God help you, woman. I hope this contraption of yours works, because if it doesn't, I don't know what else to tell you. He rode away, and Maren went back to wiring tin cans to bent saplings, 1 painful inch at a time. The first frost came on October 19th. Maren woke before dawn to find ice on the water bucket inside the cave. The children were curled together under every blanket they owned, Anna's arm wrapped protectively around Peter's small body. Their breath made tiny clouds in the cold air. The shelter wasn't finished. She had 3/4 of the dome covered in tin, but a section near the top remained open, a gap maybe 2 feet wide where she couldn't reach without a ladder she didn't have. She'd been stacking rocks to stand on, but the height was tricky and the footing unstable. The gap had to be closed. Today, Maren worked through the morning, climbing her pile of rocks again and again, wiring cans into place while her fingers went numb and her breath came in gasps. Anna brought her water that was half ice. Peter watched from inside, his small face serious, somehow understanding that this mattered. By noon, the gap was 6 inches wide. By 2 o'clock, it was closed. Maren stood back, shaking with exhaustion, and looked at what she'd built. It was ugly. The cans didn't match. Some were rusted, some still shiny. Some bent at odd angles where she'd forced them to fit. The framework bulged in places where the saplings hadn't been perfectly aligned. The edges where the dome met the cave walls were sealed with mud and stuffed with dried grass, creating a lumpy border that looked like it might fall apart in a strong wind. But it was finished, and when she stepped inside and pulled the canvas door closed behind her, the difference was immediate. The wind stopped. Outside, an October breeze was pushing across the prairie, the kind that cut through clothing and made your eyes water. Inside the shelter, the air was still and cool, not warm, not yet, but not the biting cold that had woken her that morning. Maren built a fire in the small fire pit she dug near the entrance, channeling the smoke toward a gap she'd left in the upper tin work. The wood caught slowly, then blazed. Within an hour, the space was warmer than any room she'd slept in since leaving Pennsylvania. She checked the tin walls for drafts, found 3, sealed them with mud, checked again, found 1 more, sealed it too. By nightfall, the interior temperature was holding at 60 degrees with a fire the size of her 2 fists. 60 degrees. From a fire she could have fueled with kindling. Anna pressed her hand against the cave wall, the bare chalk, exposed between the dome's edge and the natural ceiling. Mama, she said. The rock is warm. Marin touched it. The girl was right. The limestone had absorbed the fire's heat and was radiating it back, slow and steady, like a great stone oven. For the first time since she'd arrived in Kansas, Marin felt something she barely recognized. Hope. But October 19th was not January, and a fire the size of 2 fists would not hold against what was coming. Crew. Harlan Goss heard about the shelter from a traveling drummer who'd stopped to water his horse at the creek. The storekeeper rode out on October 27th, ostensibly to see if Marin needed supplies, actually to assess whether his prediction of failure had come true. He found the dome, the closed cave mouth, the woman who had not given up. He also found an opportunity. Interesting construction, he said, walking around the exterior. He poked at the tin with his finger, testing its strength. Wouldn't have thought you could make anything out of garbage. You gave me the garbage, Marin said. I made something out of it. So I did. So I did. Goss turned to face her, and his expression had shifted into something she didn't like, calculating, predatory. Here's the thing, Mrs. Lindquist. You've got a homestead claim, but you haven't proved it up yet. 5 years of continuous residence. Isn't that the requirement? Improvements to the land? I know the requirements. I'm sure you do. And I'm sure you also know that if you abandon the claim, voluntarily or otherwise, it reverts to the public domain, available for anyone to file on. He smiled his brown-toothed smile. I've been thinking about expanding my interests. A little land speculation, you might say. And this bluff of yours, well, it's got potential. Not for farming, obviously, but for mining. The chalk here has certain properties that might be valuable. Marin felt cold that had nothing to do with the October air. I'm not abandoning my claim. Not yet, but winter's coming, Mrs. Lindquist. Real winter. The kind that kills. And when it does, he spread his hands. I'll be here, ready to file the moment your claim lapses. It's nothing personal, just business. He tipped his hat and rode away. Marin watched him go, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from anger. Goss wanted her to fail, wanted her land, had probably wanted it since she first walked into his store. She thought about the venison Torsten had given her running low, about the woodpile, half a cord now, with Torsten's contribution, that still wasn't enough, about her children asleep in a tin dome in a Kansas cave, betting their lives on their mother's mad theory about earth temperatures. The wind picked up, driving grit across the prairie. In the distance, clouds were building on the northern horizon, dark and heavy, carrying something worse than rain. November was coming, and after November came the killing months. The first snow fell on November 8th. It wasn't the killing snow, not yet. Just 2 inches of white that turned the chalk bluffs into something beautiful and strange, pale rock dusted with pale powder under a slate-gray sky. The children threw snowballs at each other while Marin watched and tried to calculate how long her wood would last. 3 months, maybe 4 if she rationed severely, if the winter was mild, if nothing went wrong. The shelter was holding. At night, with a small fire burning, the interior stayed above 50 degrees, sometimes as high as 62 when she built the fire up before bed. Anna slept without shivering now. Peter's cough, the one that had worried Marin since they'd arrived, had finally faded, but her woodpile was shrinking. Every day it was smaller. Every day winter grew stronger, and every day she faced the same terrible mathematics that had haunted her since August. There was not enough. She made 2 more trips to the creek before the drifts got too deep, exhausting herself, carrying as much as her body could bear, adding another quarter cord to the pile. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. On November 22nd, Torsten came by with news. Cold snap coming, he said. He didn't dismount. The wind was too bitter for standing still. Came up from the south. Riders are saying temperatures might drop below zero before December. Below zero? Maren nodded, trying not to show her fear. How are you holding? Torsten asked. The shelter works. 60 degrees most nights with a small fire. Wood? 3/4 of a cord. Torsten's face said everything. 3/4 of a cord, with a cold snap coming, with 3 months of winter still ahead. Mrs. Lindquist, he said, I know pride is a hard thing to swallow, but if you need to leave, if you need to take those children somewhere safer, now is the time. Once the deep cold sets in, traveling won't be possible. Where would I go? He didn't have an answer for that. I'm staying, Maren said. The shelter is better than anything else I could find, and abandoning means losing everything. Torsten sat on his horse, steam rising from both of them, snow beginning to fall again. Then I hope that thing holds, he said, because what's coming, I've seen winters kill men with twice your preparations. I've seen whole families found frozen in their beds come spring. If you're betting everything on a dome made of garbage and a theory about cave temperatures. He shook his head. Well, I suppose we'll find out if you were right. He rode away into the whitening world. The temperature dropped to 4 degrees below zero that night. Inside the shelter, the fire burned, the limestone walls radiated stored heat, and Maren's family slept warm while the prairie howled outside. But morning showed the woodpile diminished by 1/20 of what remained. Christmas was still a month away, and Torsten was right. The real test hadn't come yet. December came with teeth. The temperature dropped to 15 below on the 3rd, rose to 10 above on the 7th, then plunged again. The pattern repeated, a few days of brutal cold, a brief warming, another plunge. Each cycle ate into Maren's wood supply. Each cycle tested the shelter's ability to hold heat against the hungry prairie wind, but the shelter held. On Christmas Eve, with the thermometer at the general store in Grainfield reading 18 degrees below zero, the interior of Maren's dome registered 54 degrees with a fire no larger than a man's head. The limestone walls had become a reservoir, soaking up heat during the warmer spells and releasing it during the cold. The tin shell, sealed tight with mud and grass, stopped the wind completely. The dead air space between the dome and the cave ceiling, that gap she'd worried was a flaw, turned out to be insulation better than any she could have built. Anna made a Christmas ornament from a flattened tin can, cutting it into a rough star shape with her mother's knife. They hung it from the highest point of the dome's interior framework, where it caught the firelight and threw tiny reflections across the chalk walls. Is Santa Claus going to find us in a cave? Peter asked. Santa Claus finds everyone, Maren said. She gave them each a peppermint stick she'd hidden since Grainfield, 2 cents apiece, an extravagance she couldn't afford, and told them stories about Pennsylvania until they fell asleep. That night, alone by the fire, she counted the remaining wood. 1/2 cord, maybe slightly less. 6 weeks of winter remained, possibly 8 if spring came late. At her current burn rate, she had wood for 4 weeks. Maybe 5 if she let the fire die to embers during the warmest parts of the day. The mathematics still didn't work. They were closer than they'd been in August, closer than anyone had thought possible, but they still didn't work. She needed more wood, and the drifts outside were chest-high in places, higher in others. The creek was 3 miles away through snow that would swallow her to the waist. The trip that had taken 3 hours in summer would take a full day now, if it was possible at all. Maren looked at her children, sleeping warm in a shelter everyone had said would fail. She had brought them this far. She had kept them alive through the worst of December. But January and February were still coming, and they were the killing months, the months when the cold settled in and didn't leave, when even the strongest settlers ran out of supplies and hope. The fire crackled. The limestone breathed its stored warmth. Outside, the wind screamed across the empty prairie, looking for something to kill. She was close, so close. But close wouldn't keep her children alive if the wood ran out in February. January began mild. The first week brought temperatures in the 20s, cold, but not dangerous. The sun appeared for hours at a time, melting the surface of the snow into a crust that almost supported a person's weight. Myron managed 2 trips to the creek, bringing back armloads of dead cottonwood that she dried inside the cave before burning. It wasn't much, but it was something. Word spread through the scattered homesteads about the cave woman who was still alive. Elsa Magnuson came by on January 8th, her face red from the cold, her manner different than it had been in September. Less pity, more curiosity. "They're saying your shelter holds 60 degrees, Elsa said. 55 to 62, depending on the fire. Our soddy barely holds 40 on the coldest nights. Henrik stuffs rags in every crack, and we still wake up with frost on the blankets." Maren showed her the dome's interior, the sealed tin walls, the mud-chinked edges, the way the limestone radiated heat. Elsa walked around the small space, touching the walls, feeling the warmth that seemed to come from the rock itself. "It's like an oven," Elsa said. "A stone oven turned inside out." "That's exactly what it is." Elsa stood there for a long moment, her earlier skepticism visibly crumbling. "I told you this was a toy," she said. "A play structure. I told you it wouldn't work." "You did." "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost her something. "Mrs. Lindquist, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. You understood something the rest of us didn't." It was the first time anyone had apologized. Maren found she didn't know what to say. Elsa left with a promise to send Henrik over to discuss the construction. Maybe they could build something similar, she said, an addition to their soddy that used the same principles. It wouldn't be as good as a cave, but it might be better than what they had. For the first time, someone wanted to learn from Maren instead of warn her, but the mild weather wouldn't last. She could feel it in the air, in the quality of the light, in the way the birds had vanished from the sky. Something was building in the north, something worse than anything December had delivered. The morning of January 11th dawned warmer still, 40 degrees by noon, warm enough that snow melted off the roof of the shelter and ran in rivulets down the chalk bluff. The children played outside for the first time in weeks, throwing slush balls at each other, laughing in the thin winter sunshine. Maren watched them and felt uneasy. The warmth was wrong. It was too warm, too sudden, too complete. The old-timers in Pennsylvania had a saying about weather like this. The lamb comes before the lion. She brought the children inside before dark and built the fire larger than usual. She checked the woodpile, maybe 3 weeks' worth at normal burn, 2 weeks if she had to keep the fire high constantly. She filled every container she had with water from the melting snow, water that would freeze again soon, she was certain, and might not be easily gathered for a while. At sunset, she looked north. The horizon was wrong, a darkness there, a weight in the sky that had nothing to do with nightfall. It stretched from east to west in a solid band, blotting out the stars as it grew. She had never seen anything like it. It looked less like clouds than like a wall, a physical barrier rolling toward them across the prairie. Maren went inside, barred the canvas door with its wooden frame, and told the children to stay close to the fire. "Mama," Anna's voice was small. "What's happening?" "A storm is coming." "A bad one?" Maren looked at her daughter, 7 years old, thin from a winter of rationing, but alive. Alive because of a dome made from garbage and a theory about cave temperatures. "I don't know," she said. But we're going to be all right. The shelter will hold. She said it with more confidence than she felt. The blizzard struck just before midnight. One moment the wind was gusting, unpleasant but manageable. The next moment it was screaming, a sound like nothing Marin had ever heard, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the entire sky had torn open and was emptying itself onto the prairie. The temperature plummeted. Marin could feel it even inside the shelter, the sudden bite in the air, the fire struggling against an enemy it couldn't see. She fed it more wood, too much wood, more than she could afford, and watched the flames bend sideways as gusts found their way through cracks she'd thought were sealed. By 1 in the morning, the tin walls were rattling. By 2, she could hear ice crystals pinging against the metal like someone throwing sand. By 3, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the howling white nothing, pressing against the shelter from all sides, trying to get in. Anna woke crying. Peter woke silent, which was worse, his eyes huge in the firelight, fixed on the shaking walls. "Mama, is the house going to fall down?" "No, the house is strong. The house will hold." Marin pulled them both close, wrapping blankets around the 3 of them, positioning their bodies between the children and the door. If the shelter failed, if the tin tore away, if the saplings cracked, they would have seconds, not minutes. The cold outside wasn't cold anymore. It was something else entirely, something that killed. The fire burned, the wind screamed, the night stretched on forever. At some point, 4 in the morning, maybe 5, Peter started coughing. It was the cough that had worried Marin in October, the one she'd thought was gone. But it was back now, deeper than before, rattling in his small chest like something broken. His forehead, when she touched it, was burning. Fever. In a 4-year-old. In the middle of the worst blizzard she'd ever seen. She had no medicine. She had no doctor within 20 miles, and even if there had been one next door, no one could have reached them through what was happening outside. She had water and blankets, and a fire that was eating through her wood supply at a terrifying rate. She had her children. That was all. Marin held Peter against her chest, feeling the heat of his fever through his clothes, listening to the wet rattle of his breathing. Anna pressed close on her other side, silent now, understanding that something was terribly wrong. "Is Peter going to die?" Anna whispered. "No." Marin said it with absolute certainty, because absolute certainty was the only thing she had to give. "Peter's going to be fine. The fever will break. The storm will pass. We're going to be all right." The shelter shook. The wind found new cracks, new gaps, needles of cold air threading through the sealed edges. Marin stuffed cloth into every gap she could reach, one-handed, holding Peter with the other arm. The fire needed more wood. She gave it more wood. The temperature outside was dropping still. She couldn't know the exact number. There was no thermometer in the shelter, but she could feel it in the quality of the cold, in the way her breath hung in the air even near the fire. Later, she would learn that the temperature that night dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 11 degrees below zero in the span of 6 hours. Later, she would learn that wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, that the wind chill reached 60 degrees below zero, that livestock across the prairie were freezing to death where they stood. Now she knew only that her son was sick, her shelter was shaking, and the darkness outside wanted her children dead. Dawn brought no relief. The sun rose somewhere behind the white chaos, invisible, its light diffused into a gray nothing that was neither day nor night. The storm had not lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger, the wind's pitch shifting higher, the ice crystals driving harder against the tin walls. Peter's fever had climbed. He was listless now, his eyes glassy, his cough producing sounds that made Marin's stomach clench. She gave him water mixed with a little honey, the last of the honey she'd been saving, and held him upright to ease his breathing. Anna sat by the fire, feeding it sticks, keeping it alive. 7 years old, and she understood the stakes without being told. "Is it going to stop?" she asked. "All storms stop eventually." When? Maren didn't know. The blizzard had been raging for 8 hours, then 10, then 12. It showed no signs of weakening, and with every hour that passed, her woodpile shrank. By noon, though noon was merely a guess, a brightening of the gray that might have been imagination, she had burned through a quarter of what remained. At this rate, she had 2 days of wood left. Maybe 3 if she let the fire die down, but letting the fire die down meant letting the temperature drop, and letting the temperature drop meant letting Peter get sicker. The mathematics she had feared all winter had finally arrived. Not enough wood, not enough time. The shelter could hold 60 degrees if she had fuel. Without fuel, it would hold 50. 50 was survivable for healthy people. 50 might not be survivable for a 4-year-old with pneumonia. She didn't know it was pneumonia. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that her son was burning with fever and drowning in his own lungs, and there was nothing she could do except keep him warm and pray. The storm continued. At some point in the early afternoon, 1 o'clock, maybe 2, Maren heard something beneath the wind, a sound that didn't belong, a rhythm, a pattern, something almost like pounding. Someone was pounding on something. She pressed her ear to the canvas door, straining to hear through the shriek of the blizzard. There it was again. Not wind, not ice. Someone hitting wood or stone, over and over, a desperate drumbeat barely audible through the chaos. Someone was outside. Maren cracked the door against the wind's pressure and immediately regretted it. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She couldn't see anything, just white. Absolute white, as if the world had been erased and replaced with nothing. "Hello?" she screamed into the void. No answer, just the wind, just the endless, howling white. But the pounding continued, somewhere to her left. Close, maybe 50 feet away, maybe less. Someone was out there, someone alive, someone who would die in minutes if they didn't find shelter. Maren looked back at her children. Anna, feeding the fire. Peter, wrapped in blankets, struggling to breathe. If she went outside, she might not find her way back. The whiteout was complete. 5 steps from the door and she would be lost, wandering blind until the cold took her. But someone was out there. "Anna?" Her voice was steady, somehow. "Stay here, keep the fire burning, keep your brother warm. Don't open the door for anyone except me." "Mama, don't. I'll be right back." She grabbed the rope they used for a clothesline, tied one end to the door frame, and wrapped the other end around her waist. Then she stepped out into the white death of January 12th, 1888. The cold was absolute. It penetrated her coat, her dress, her skin, her bones. Within seconds, her face was numb. Within a minute, she couldn't feel her hands. She kept one hand on the rope, the other stretched in front of her, and pushed into the wind toward the sound of pounding. 5 steps. 10. The rope played out behind her, her only connection to survival. The pounding was closer now, definitely closer, coming from somewhere ahead and to the left. "Hello!" she screamed again. This time, a voice answered, faint, desperate, nearly swallowed by the storm. "Help! Over here!" Maren pushed toward the voice. The rope ran out. She had maybe 40 feet of line, and the voice was still ahead of her. She hesitated for one terrible moment, then untied the rope from her waist and let it fall into the snow, keeping only the memory of its direction. If she was wrong, if she lost her bearing, she would die out here. Her children would wait in the shelter, feeding the fire, watching the door, and their mother would never come back. She kept moving. Her foot hit something solid, a body. Someone curled on the ground, barely moving, their clothes already stiff with ice. Marin grabbed them, grabbed clothing, grabbed arms, grabbed whatever she could hold, and pulled. The body was heavy, resistant, frozen to the ground in places. She pulled harder. "Get up!" she screamed. "Get up or you'll die!" A face turned toward her. A woman's face, ice-crusted, eyes barely open. Elsa Magnusson. "Marin?" The voice was a whisper, confused, dying. "Is that Marin? Get up. Now." She hauled Elsa to her feet, draped the woman's arm over her shoulders, and turned to find the rope. It wasn't there. The wind had shifted, or she had turned wrong, or the rope had been buried in drifting snow. She couldn't see it. She couldn't see anything. The cave was somewhere behind her, maybe 40 feet away, but behind and 40 feet meant nothing in a whiteout. Every direction was the same. Every direction was death. Marin stood in the howling white, holding a dying woman, completely lost. Then she remembered. The wind. When the storm started, this wind had been from the north-northwest, driving directly against the cave mouth. The shelter's door faced roughly south. If she walked into the wind, she would walk toward the cave. She turned her face into the blast of ice and snow, let it sandpaper her skin, let it blind her completely, and walked. 1 step, 2, 3. Elsa was barely moving now, her weight almost dead on Marin's shoulders. The wind screamed, the cold burned. 5 steps, 6, 7. She was going to miss the cave. She was going to walk right past it and keep walking until they both froze. 8 steps, 9. Her hand hit stone. Not the door, the stone of the bluff itself, the chalk face beside the cave entrance. She felt along it, found the curve where natural rock gave way to bent saplings, and flattened tin, found the canvas door. "Anna, open it, now." The door swung inward. Warmth poured out, glorious, impossible warmth. Marin shoved Elsa inside and followed, pulling the door closed behind them, collapsing against it as the wind fought to follow them in. For a long moment there was only breathing, only the fire's crackle and Peter's wet cough and the distant howl of the blizzard outside. Then Elsa spoke. "Henrik," she said. "Henrik is still out there, and the Miller family. They were all trying to reach the Thompsons' house. We got separated. She coughed, ice falling from her hair as she thawed. "We were on the road when it hit. We couldn't see anything. Everyone scattered. Henrik went one way, I went another, and I don't know where anyone is. I just kept walking. I walked into something, the bluff, I think, and I couldn't go any further." The Thompsons' house was 3 miles from the bluff. The road ran within 100 yards of Marin's cave. If Elsa had been walking along the road, others might have been too. "How many?" Marin asked. "How many were with you?" 8. No, 9. The Millers have 3 children, and the Goss boy came with us, the storekeeper's son, and 9 people. Lost in a blizzard. Walking along a road that passed the cave. Marin looked at her fire, her woodpile, her sick son. Then she looked at the door, shaking in its frame, and the white death beyond it. "Anna," she said, "build the fire up. Use as much wood as you need. I'm going back out." She found Henrik Magnusson first, 200 yards east of the cave, crawling on his hands and knees. The rope trick worked this time. She tied one end to the bluff face and played it out as she went, following the road's approximate line by memory and wind direction. Henrik was barely conscious, his hands frozen into claws, his face the gray-white of advanced frostbite. She got him to his feet and dragged him back to the cave. The second trip brought Cora Miller and her youngest child, a girl of 2 who had stopped crying because she no longer had the strength. They had fallen into a drift and couldn't get out. Cora was screaming for her husband and other children, screaming so loud Maren heard her through the storm. The third trip brought the Goss boy, Timothy, 16 years old, the son of the storekeeper who had wanted Maren's land. He had been within 30 feet of the cave entrance, collapsed in the snow, facing the wrong direction. If Maren hadn't found him, he would have frozen within sight of safety. The fourth trip brought nothing, and the fifth. She walked the rope to its end, screaming into the wind, and heard no answer. Maren went back inside. The shelter was crowded now, 8 people in a space designed for 3. Elsa was tending Peter, who was still burning with fever but still breathing. Henrik sat by the fire, his hands wrapped in cloth, shaking uncontrollably. Cora Miller held her daughter and wept silently. There were still people missing. Arthur Miller and his 2 older children, still out there somewhere in the killing white. "I have to go again," Maren said. "You can't." Elsa's voice was raw. "You've been out 4 times. Your face is frostbitten. Your hands are... Look at your hands." Maren looked. She couldn't feel them anymore, but she could see them swollen, waxy, the color of old candles. Frostbite. If she went out again, she might lose fingers. If she didn't go out, the Millers would die. "I can't stop." "Mrs. Lindquist." Timothy Goss spoke from his place near the fire. His voice was shaking, his lips blue. "Mrs. Lindquist," my father said. "He said you'd die in this cave. He said your shelter was worthless. He said..." The boy's voice broke. "He was wrong. You saved my life. But if you go out again, you'll die. And everyone you've saved will be alone in here when the fire burns down. You can't save everyone. You've done enough." The wind howled. The shelter shook. Peter coughed, a terrible rattling sound, and Maren looked at her son who needed her, who was fighting to breathe, who might not survive the night if she wasn't here to hold him. She stayed. The blizzard lasted 18 hours. It ended sometime after midnight on January 13th, the wind dying as suddenly as it had arrived, the temperature holding at 18 degrees below zero in a silence that felt like deafness. The stars came out, brilliant and cold, indifferent to the damage below. At dawn, Silas Torsten and 3 other men broke through the drifts to the cave entrance. They found 8 people alive inside: Maren, her 2 children, Elsa, and Henrik Magnusson, Cora Miller and her youngest, and Timothy Goss. The fire had burned down to embers. The woodpile was gone. The temperature inside the shelter was 52 degrees. Cold, but survivable. Arthur Miller and his 2 older children were found that afternoon, frozen, a quarter mile from the road. They had walked in circles until they couldn't walk anymore. They died within 300 yards of safety. Across the prairie, the count was worse. The Hendersons, a family of 5, dead in their cabin when their stove failed. Old man Driscoll, frozen on his porch. The Westergaard boy, who had tried to reach the barn to save the livestock. Everywhere the story was the same. People caught in the open, people who ran out of fuel, people who didn't have enough shelter to survive what January 12th had brought. But not in the cave. In the cave, a dome made of garbage and bent saplings had held 60 degrees of warmth through the worst blizzard in Kansas history. Everyone who reached Maren's shelter survived. Torsten came back 3 days later, when the roads were passable and the death count was becoming clear. He stood inside the dome, the miraculous dome people were calling it now, and looked at the tin walls, the willow framework, the mud chinking that had somehow held against 50-mile-per-hour winds. "I told you that you'd die," he said. "You did." "I told you those children would freeze." "You did." He was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "Mrs. Lindquist," he finally said, "I've been in Kansas for 12 years. I have survived storms that killed men better prepared than me. I thought I knew what it took to make it through a prairie winter." He paused. "I was wrong. What you built here, I don't fully understand it, but I know it works, and I know you saved lives that would have been lost otherwise." He held out his hand. Maren shook it. "I owe you an apology," Torsten said. "And so does everyone else who told you this was impossible. We were all so certain we knew better. But you," he shook his head, "you understood something we didn't. The earth holds its own warmth. You just had to know how to use it." He turned to leave, then stopped. "My neighbor Gustafson wants to build one of these. So does the preacher in Grainfield for the church basement. They're going to need someone to show them how." He looked back at her. "I figured you might be willing to teach, for a fair price, of course." It was the first time anyone had offered to pay Maren for anything except the work Harlan Goss had hinted at. "I'll teach them for free," she said. "What I built because I had to. It shouldn't cost anyone else what it cost me." Within a month, 3 new cave shelters had been started along the chalk bluffs. By spring, there were 7. Maren shared the design with anyone who asked. The bent saplings, the overlapping tin, the way the Earth's constant temperature could be harnessed to reduce fuel consumption. She explained the principles to farmers who had never thought about thermal mass, to merchants who had laughed at her garbage collecting, to women who had whispered about the crazy widow in the cave. Peter's fever broke 2 days after the blizzard. The pneumonia. That's what the doctor from Hayes City called it. When he finally arrived a week later, had nearly killed him, but the warmth of the shelter had given his body the chance to fight. He was thin and weak for months afterward, but he lived. Harlan Goss never came to see the shelter. His son Timothy did, came back twice, in fact, to thank Maren again for saving his life. The boy said his father didn't speak of it, didn't speak of the cave woman at all anymore. The land speculation scheme had died with Goss's certainty that Maren would fail. Elsa Magnuson and her husband built a stone-lined addition to their soddy that spring, incorporating the same principles Maren had discovered. Small space, sealed walls, thermal mass, efficient fire. Henrik's frostbitten hands healed, though he lost the tip of one finger. They named their first son, born that December, Peter, after the boy who had coughed through the blizzard while his mother saved strangers from the snow. Maren Lindquist proved up her homestead claim in 1892, 5 years after she'd arrived with $8 and a theory about caves. She never married again. She raised her children in the bluff shelter, improving it each year, adding a proper door, a better stovepipe, a stone floor, until it was comfortable enough that visitors marveled rather than pitied. She died in 1917 at the age of 63, in the same cave where she had once held a fevered child while the world outside tried to kill them. Anna and Peter buried her on the bluff, overlooking the prairie that had tried so hard to defeat her. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 18 degrees below zero in less than half a day. Wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour. The wind chill plunged to 60 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill healthy men within sight of their own doors. Silas Torsten, who had survived 12 Kansas winters, had looked at a woman with $8 and 2 children and delivered his verdict. "You'll be dead before spring, and those children will die with you." He was wrong. In a cave in the chalk bluffs of Gove County, Kansas, a dome made of garbage held steady at 52 degrees while the prairie howled and froze and killed. 8 people huddled inside, strangers who had become survivors, doubters who had become believers, a sick child who had become a testament to his mother's refusal to accept the mathematics of impossibility. The skeptics had done their counting. $8 couldn't buy a house. One woman couldn't cut enough wood. A shelter made of trash couldn't stop a blizzard. Maren Lindquist had done different counting. 50 degrees was warmer than zero. A small fire was better than no fire. Something was better than nothing, and sometimes something was enough. The tin star Anna had made still hangs in the Gove County Historical Museum, tarnished now, the edges rough where a 7-year-old cut it with her mother's knife. Beneath it, a small card reads, Christmas 1887, from the Lindquist shelter. It catches the light, that star. Throws tiny reflections across the display case, the same way it once threw reflections across limestone walls while a mother held her children and a blizzard tried to break down the door. The storm passed. The star remained. Some things do.